Hello everyone, Professor Zeeb here, and welcome to another video lecture. This time we're going to talk some Erikson. We have actually reached Erikson's last stage, which is called integrity versus despair. Let's just kind of review a little bit. If you guys remember from early on, Erikson's theory is really cumulative. So in other words, it builds on itself. So this stage basically represents the culmination of all those previous stages that we've talked about, learned about. In other words, this is where someone's reflecting back on their life and they're sort of making a judgment call. Am I satisfied? You know, am I okay with how I live my life? And we're going to get into all the specifics. So the point is, this is really the culmination of everything that the person has gone through in their life in this final stage, integrity versus despair. All right, so let's take a look here and go through the specifics. Okay, so Erikson's theory, integrity versus despair, our final stage in his theory here. All right, so what this stage basically represents is the achievement of the previous 7 crises that leads to what Erikson believed is called integrity, which is really related to feeling content and satisfied with your life there, okay? So let's take a look here more specifically. So integrity, what that basically means, and by the way, it's a little bit different than the ordinary meaning of what integrity, what you would think it would mean, but really this is the feeling that your life has been well spent. You're feeling content about the outcome of your life. This is someone who's able to face death without fear. Do you guys understand what that means? In other words, you've done everything you were supposed to do. You feel confident and happy with how things turned out in your life in your final chapter here. And therefore, you're ready to sort of conclude your life. This is someone who appreciates their life and appreciates their individuality as it was experienced throughout their lifetime. In other words, it's simply someone who's satisfied with their achievements. Erikson believed that this is accomplished by introspection and reminiscing about their life. In other words, what that means is that as an older person, over 65 in this particular case, in our last stage, it's someone kind of towards the end, and they're thinking about all those previous chapters in their life, or stages, as Erikson would say, the crises, and they're just going through those, and they're really happy and content with how things sort of turned out. You know, they're very satisfied with how their life played out. So in other words, this really involves looking back and remembering and sort of evaluating your life and sort of making a judgment call. Are you content with how things turned out? So in other words, if you look back at your life, yeah, I lived a great life. I had a great marriage. I did this right. I accomplished these goals, for example. You probably feel pretty good about that once you reach older adulthood. So in other words, this person is just really content with how things played out. Well, let's say that you're 65 plus, you're towards the end here, or getting towards the end, and you're looking back in your life, and it's just the feeling of regret or the feeling of not being happy with how things played out. There's a lot of upset feelings and regrets going on about in terms of how your life was played out. Erikson related that to something called despair. In other words, it's this feeling towards the end of your life where you feel you've really made the wrong decisions. You're unsatisfied with how things played out. In other words, I never should have married this person. I always wanted to do this, but I never got a chance to, or I never actually did it. In other words, it could be that your goals were unmet. It's just regret, regret, regret when you look through all those different chapters and so forth. In other words, this person is just feeling horrible because you can't go back and change it now. You're kind of having to live with how you lived your life, if that makes sense. You're having to swallow it, so to speak, and therefore you're unsatisfied. Despair, in a sense, is really similar to feeling depressed. You're just sort of upset and just really down about how your life played out. I should have done this better. I should have done that. It's just a lot of regrets going on. And what's hard about it is you can't go back and change it. I mean, once again, you have to sort of live with, you have to sort of accept how your life played out. So to kind of explain this one, a good way to an easy way to kind of judge if you feel integrity or despair about your life as an older person. And by the way, this is something that Erikson used himself as an example. He turned to the very famous German philosopher Nietzsche. So I don't know if you guys have taken philosophy yet. Take it, it's an interesting class. But one of the great philosophers was this German gentleman by the name of Nietzsche, his last name. And he gave this example that Erikson borrowed to demonstrate integrity versus despair. So work with me on this, guys, as we go through this. I want you to imagine yourself as an older person at the end of your life, and you're walking alone on this mountain trail. So in other words, you're going down this path in this mountainous region by yourself, and you come upon a bridge, and you start to cross the bridge, and you encounter a troll. The troll confronts you and instantly devours you, and you die. I know it's kind of a sad story. The very next day, this person, whether man or woman, is born to the exact same parents, lives the exact same life all over again to the point where they were on the trail again. So they lived their whole life exactly how they lived it before, to the point where they're an older person alone on the trail. They're now walking down the trail. They encounter the bridge and the troll. The troll eats them again and devours them, and on we go. The point here, guys, if you're willing to do that again and again, outside of the monotony, of course, of doing that, that shows integrity. In other words, if you're willing to live the exact same life, the exact same experiences, all the different things that you did, the goals that you accomplished, those kind of things. So if you're willing to say, yes, I would do this again, that kind of shows integrity, because that shows that you're content with how your life played out. You're willing to do it all over again in exactly the same way. Yes, we all make mistakes, but they're acceptable mistakes, and you feel satisfied with your achievements. That shows integrity. However, if we have someone that would say, no way would I live the exact same life again and go through that again, that's showing the glimmerings of despair, because that shows that you have regret. There's uncertainty, you know, there's hesitancy in terms of doing it all over again. You know, I never want to go through that experience again, or I never want to live this life. I would have made so many changes in my life, is kind of the point. That shows that the person is not necessarily content with how their life played out, and thus that's showing kind of like despair. In other words, they're unhappy with how their life played out. So in conclusion, Erikson really believed that this is sort of a summary phase or chapter of your life, or a stage where you're really reflecting back and you're sort of getting a feel, were you happy about how your life played out, or is it filled with regret? And you can kind of see how that relates to the different terms we've discussed. All right, so hopefully that helps you understand this last stage a little bit better in terms of Erikson. All right, so this will conclude our short lecture here. Please move on to the next step in the class, and we will see you online.